So it's just a couple of things I left out from the first introductory session. So one of the things what I said is that, for the sentence correction and for the text completion and sentence equivalence on the GRE, you have roughly 90 seconds to answer each question. Right, so you get about 20 questions and you've got roughly 30 minutes to answer them. So it leaves you about 90 seconds. So time, as you probably already realize, is a big factor. And one thing I've noticed is that you can really improve this by just being familiar with, the layout of the test. So what I recommend is you try to carry out as many practice tests as possible, and not just the practice tests that give you practice questions. I mean actual tests from start to finish, and the ones that are computerized, because then you get familiar with all the little buttons and all the instructions, so that then when you do the actual test, you don't have to waste time reading all that. You can just go straight to the questions. And there are sites where you can do actual practice tests. I don't know if any of you have done any real practice tests yet, but the ETS website, ETS are these are the sort of the creators of the GRE test. If you go to their website, they will allow you to do one real practice test. It's identical to the one that you would do in a real GMAT test. And GMAT, you'll find a couple of GMAT tests out there as well, I think. So what I suggest is taking as many practice tests as you can. And The Economist have an online site, a website, which is very good for revising the GMAT. They've got a lot of resources, and they have a real practice test. So I recommend taking that if you have the time and the opportunity. So there's ETS, there is The Economist. Get familiar with all the screen buttons: mark, continue, review, exit section, copy, paste. You need to be familiar with all this before you do the real test, because you don't want to be wasting time trying things out, sampling, what does this do, what does that do? You already want to know what it does, so you can just focus all your attention on answering the questions. So when you go to do the GMAT test, there'll be a couple of pages on the screen which introduce you to the test and give you general introductions of what you can and cannot do in the test and so on. Again, if you're already familiar with that, you don't need to waste your time reading all the introductory screens. You can move straight on to the questions. And each section of the test also has a paragraph or two instructing you about what to do with that particular section. Familiarize yourself with that in advance so you can go straight to the questions. So then you don't have to waste time reading the directions during the actual test. What I always recommend, it depends on your schedule. A lot of people are busy, but I aim to learn 5 to 7 new words every day. It's not a great amount for one day, but over 6 months, you've got quite a number of words there. So improve your memory. How much time do we have for this? Dominic O'Brien, as I said, is 8 times world memory champion. I've learned a lot from him. He has paid for courses. Obviously, I'm not promoting his paid for courses, but he also has a lot of free stuff on the internet that you can access, where he shows you the types of techniques he uses to develop a really powerful memory. And it's, so for GMAT and GRE purposes, it's a very, very useful thing, but it also helps you in life generally. With GRE especially, there's so many words that you have to remember. I think, his techniques can be very useful for you. So that's just something to keep in mind. So another thing I recommend is just exposing yourself to as many quality academic English sources as possible, and it's knowing the types of sources that you should be reading. And The Economist is a fine example, but journal articles as well. You know, articles from scientific publications. The thing about, you know, the reading comprehension in GMAT and GRE, it could be on any topic. A topic like philosophy that, you know, I personally am quite familiar with and happy to read. You know, I can do quite well with that. But if it's on a topic such as geology or astrophysics, maybe I'm not so good. So it could actually be on anything. So the idea is to read as broadly as possible of the right type of material, just to expose yourself to those words, okay? Another technique is when you're learning the words, the vocabulary, try to break words down. Look at the roots and the stems, prefixes and suffixes of words, and start to see patterns in the types of suffixes and prefixes that are used in words. You know, for example, before, as a prefix, pre means something before something else, and that will indicate, you know, give you a clue as to the meaning of the word. Right, so the three keys to GRE, at least reading comprehension preparation, that I've said in sentence equivalent and verbal generally, is 1, to read academic English every day, 2, read academic English every day, and 3, again, read academic English every day. There's no real substitute for that. The more you are reading academic English, the better you will get. And you need to be doing it relatively often. You know, if not every day, you know, at least every few days. A couple of suggested websites for reading generally. These have a good standard of academic style language. Scientific American is a good one. Nature is another science-based one. The Atlantic, all types of current affairs. Foreign policy, maybe on international relations, The Economist. So just a few top tips. Don't neglect your weaknesses. Often, if we have weaknesses, we tend to focus more on our strengths because it's the things we're doing better. And you know, it's uncomfortable sometimes to focus on the things that we find more difficult, and we tend to put that off. Don't do that. You know, focus on your weak points just as much as your strengths. Practice under exam conditions, so time yourself. That's really important. The timing is such a big factor. Take the GMAT-GRE at least once, the real one. Keep a positive attitude. Manage your expectations. So be familiar with test directions before the test, I've already said, and take plenty of practice tests. But for the remainder of this session, and at least the next one, probably maybe even two, we're going to look at critical reasoning. It seems to me that you guys have done quite well with critical reasoning, and it's the section where you have least problems, and that's probably because it's the most maths oriented of the verbal. You know, it's about logic. It's not really about, you know, the use of language. So if you're good at logic anyway, then you're probably good at critical reasoning. So you probably know, so we've done a lot of preparation. There's a bit of theory here, so I'm going to be talking a bit more, but please stop any questions. So you might be aware there's no independent section on the GRE or GMAT exam that's devoted just to critical reasoning. It's a subsection of the reading comprehension section. The GRE critical reasoning comes in two places. It comes as a subsection of reading comprehension and in the analytical writing exercise, analysis of an argument. Okay, there it's a standard critical reasoning question. I mean, this might be going over content that you're already aware of. If you've studied this before with Victor or you've had courses in logic. But it's just the basics of argument structure and construction. You're probably already familiar with this terminology. Arguments contain a premise and a conclusion. The conclusion is the point which the author is trying to convince the reader about. And then an assumption is an unstated premise or an unquestioned belief which a conclusion is based upon. Now, the thing about the critical reasoning questions is that we're often trying to identify hidden assumptions. That's what it's all about, really, because the arguments are being motivated by assumptions that are not being made explicit, and often they're false.
Philip, I have a brief question about the distinguishing between conclusion and inference.
Okay, good.
So the inference, this is something implied, yes?
Yeah,
and
that's right.
Well, it couldn't be directly stated as it's, well, is it written? But what about conclusion? Is it conclusion overlapping with inference? So the difference between conclusion and in inference, that the conclusion should be directly stated, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. That's one difference. I say the conclusion is something that's usually explicit, but it's usually the point of the argument, whereas an inference is both implied, it's not explicit, but it's also not usually the main point of the argument. It's a subsidiary point or a secondary point. Yeah. So there's two differences between an inference and a conclusion. It's implicit and it is secondary to the main argument. But often the questions in reading comprehension, they will be asking you about an inference. What can we infer from this? The premises plus assumptions equals the conclusion. And in critical reasoning, as I said, we try to uncover hidden or unquestioned assumptions, which the author is tacitly, means secretly, or covertly, depending on, to provide force to his argument. Just as correct language follows correct rules of grammar, correct argumentation follows the rules of logic, and we should really have some familiarity with rules of logic in order to know, pick apart where the arguments are going wrong. Have you come across this before, deductive and inductive reasoning? Can anybody just briefly, in simple terms, mention what the difference is?
So the deductive structured in the chain way, as I understand, and this is from the set to the particular case based, but based on the inductive, we're considering several cases and then make a conclusion about the whole set.
Yes, that's right. And what's the difference in the relative validity of arguments based on these two different methods?
Sorry, what do you mean?
So if you had an argument that was deductive in form, it's valid. Which would you see as being as having more weight or having more validity as an argument, a deductive or an inductive?
Well, I think, it depends on the particular situation, but in common sense, I would like to follow the deductive reasoning, because inductive reasoning couldn't consider all of the cases, and we can't do any conclusion about the whole set based on, for example, 3 cases. Well, if I understand, there are 1,000 or million of cases, and it could be
that's right.
different properties.
Yeah, that's right. So if the deductive argument is sound, then it's going to be valid all the time. It's universally valid, and you can't critique it. Yeah. But the inductive form is just probabilistic. So to a certain sort of degree of probability, it will be correct. Yeah, or to a certain level of of whatever the data sort of allows us to infer. But it won't be universally, or not necessarily universally correct. So we cannot have the confidence that it will be universally correct, as you said, because it's based on a limited, finite number of cases. So the thing about the critical reasoning is that usually you've got an argument which is actually inductive in form, but they're trying to make it seem as though it's deductive. So knowing the difference here can help sometimes. So deductive, this is usually used as a standard example of a pure form of deductive reasoning. Socrates is a man. All men are mortal, therefore Socrates is mortal. There's no way around this. It has to be true, yeah? It has to be valid. But from the premises combined, we can deduce that Socrates is immortal. If the premises and the conclusion are consistent, then the deduction is valid and the conclusion necessarily holds. So when you're assessing the critical reasoning arguments, you can perhaps have this example here as your sort of benchmark for the validity of an argument. And if the argument does not seem to meet the conditions that are in the sort of conditions of the pure deductive form as expressed in this argument, then there'll be something wrong with it. So an invalid argument: Socrates has grey hair. Some men who have grey hair are philosophers, therefore Socrates is a philosopher. You can all see there why that doesn't follow. And so the critical reasoning arguments will usually follow, in reality they'll follow this format here. But they're trying to make it appear like they're the previous format, purely valid argument, when they're not. They're more like this. And your task is to identify that and identify where the problems lie, or the weaknesses lie. So just a few rhetorical questions that are applicable to. So your task is to look for the type of evidence that would be necessary to complete the argument and make it valid. So how many Italians who like pizza would you have to meet to conclude that all Italians like pizza? You'd have to meet all of them. So what we're essentially asking here is, how valid is our generalization? And this is one important question you should have in your mind when you're looking at the critical reasoning questions. How valid is the generalization that's being made? How did they arrive at that conclusion? On the basis of what evidence? Okay, so when dealing with claims made in the critical reasoning section, you need to ask, what evidence does the author present to support his or her view? And then assess the quality of that evidence. For example, the people who live in Bayside do not like water sports. This is taken from an actual critical reasoning question. So immediately we say, it's a claim about a whole set of people. How does the researcher know that all these people do not like water sports? How has he collected the data, firstly? What's the basis for this generalization? So there are also issues concerning methodology, the method by which we obtain the data or evidence. Obviously, some ways of collecting the data are better than others, and scientists use strict criteria for deciding which methods are acceptable and which are not. So we need to learn this terminology in order to critique the arguments. But to ask 3 friends who live near Bayside if they like water sports would not be a reliable way to obtain data about the Bayside residents. How would we obtain data on this? Does anyone want to tell me? If you were an actual researcher, how would you obtain reliable data in this situation?
I would like to do some kind of social survey.
Yes.
And,
yeah.
and
Yeah.
do a lot of effort to make them representative.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
In terms of population structure and etc.
Yeah, that's right. So you're using the right type of language there that you get bonus marks for. Scientific language. You would need to make a survey that was representative of the target population.
Moreover, I would like to test the zero hypothesis. If my survey results is just like a random error, is it like I don't guys, please help me. How could I tell in English случайно?
Accidentally.
Accidentally. Well, the result of the survey is accidentally.
Yeah. No, it is as an accident. Is what we would say there, if the so the data that you've collected is a result of chance,
yes,
or is it a result of a statistically significant, an actual difference in the, in the data, in the population? So we use the word chance there in that context. Yeah, so it's just about, using the right type of terminology. It's not just being able to critique the argument, but you get bonus points for using the right type of terminology. And in that context there, we'd say, for example, we want to be sure that the results we have obtained are not from chance. That it's not a false positive or a false negative. They are actually, representing a real effect. And as we go through, I'll just be using this terminology a lot so you become more familiar with it. But a survey would be ideal in this context. So, as I say here, properly designed surveys and questionnaires are two ways in which we can obtain reliable and valid data to support claims we want to make. If the GRE or GMAT critical reasoning passage mentions surveys, then your critique should center on the design, the reliability, or the validity of the survey. Typically, you might ask, how was the survey designed? Or how representative was it? Was it anonymous, for example, because we know that a survey that's designed anonymously will probably get a different type of answer from one that was not. What particular questions did it ask? Were they leading questions? Was the sampling done in a random manner? Okay, so these standard sorts of social science, questions that you want to ask. So if the GRE passage does not mention surveys, but says, for example, when asked, Bayside residents said they prefer water sports, you want to ask, how does the author know? So here's an example from the critical reasoning. Has anybody seen this example before? No, good. No, good. So Dan is clearly an incompetent detective. He has solved a smaller percentage of the cases assigned to him in the last 3 years, only 1 out of 25, less than any other detective on the police force. Okay. So what's the claim here? The claim is that Dan has solved far fewer crimes than any other detective. What's the conclusion being made, drawn from that?
That he's an incompetent detective.
Yeah, he's incompetent. Right. Good. Does it follow?
No.
Right. Why not?
Because I can I can present a similar for example sentence with completely different inference that Dan is clearly the best detective. He has engaged in the most complicated assignments, but his hit percentages of only 4%.
Yeah.
Well, for like 3 years, but he's the best in the similar time.
That's right. Yeah. So this is very similar in structure to one that you got on the, it was the Vasquez Morel Assurance, specializes in insuring manufacturers. If you remember that one, it was question 1 on the critical reasoning. It's exactly the same structure. It just uses a different scenario. And again, this is the thing about the GRE questions, once you master the different structures, there's only a finite number of them. They will come in different forms, but it's essentially the same structure. You've obviously seen this structure before, so you're able to answer it. So the conclusion is not valid because he might be the best detective, and because he's the best, he gets assigned the most difficult cases, and that takes him longer to do.